recording. Welcome everyone to the September InterReach webinar with our guest today, Alan Paul. So I just want to first remind everyone that we are recording today's webinar as always, and that the webinar will be available on our webinar archives at interreach.org. So please go ahead and navigate over to that website whenever you get a chance to view all of the old ones, the old webinars, and take a peek at our upcoming events as well. So let me just make sure we've got everyone. We got a bunch of people still joining, which is great. All right. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in here. So our guest today, as I said, is Alan Paul, and Alan Paul retired from the University of California in 2012 after serving in several senior administrative positions, including Director of Strategic Initiatives at UC Riverside's College of Natural and Agricultural Sciences, Deputy Director for Special Projects at UCLA's Brain Research Institute, and Program Director in the UCLA Anderson School of Management's Office of Executive Education Programs. In these roles, he was responsible for the design, funding, and implementation of large institutional projects. Alan's firm, Giant Angstrom Partners, serves government, universities, and nonprofit organizations. Most of his work now centers on training and coaching university leaders in program design and proposal development. He has also consulted for school districts, healthcare organizations, law enforcement agencies, and faith-based organizations. Past projects include program design and evaluation, proposal development, and writing business planning, board retreats, policy analysis, economic development planning, and executive education. Giant Angstrom applies theory to real-world problems to solve problems of the organizational development. Alan is now writing his dissertation in economic geography, examining the university as an industrial system and its role in regional development. He was born in New York City, grew up in rural Arizona, attended the University of Wisconsin, and now resides in Los Angeles. So I just want to say welcome to Alan again, and also to the whole group today. And please go ahead and let's see, Alan, if everyone has any questions, put them in the chat. Is that correct?
Yeah, and if you have questions, put them in the chat. If it's important to answer it and right then, I'll answer it right then, or you can just hold them till the end and I'll leave plenty of time for open questions.
Great. All right. Well, with that, leave it to you to take it away for us.
Thanks, Christine. I'm going to do a short presentation and then we'll just kind of go from there. So let me share my screen here. All right, you guys all have that? Good. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about writing management plans for team science proposals, specifically from the perspective of someone who works in research development. Now, I know our group has a lot of folks from various stripes. Some of us work in research development. Some of us actually are managing team science projects. Others are people who are studying team science. And so I just want to say that this is really from the perspective of a research development person. And so what we do is we train faculty and students and postdocs how to write winning proposals, and we consult and advise them on that. And in that regard, we are very much win-focused and reviewer-oriented. You know, the PI is interested in their science, and we're interested in seeing them get the money for their science. And we take on a very broad scope of projects, everything from fellowship applications to individual investigator research grants, student support activities, and then team science projects. And so for today, I just want to focus on the big convergent team science projects. They're the most complex. They have the biggest scope of management issues. So I'll talk about those, and you should recognize that if your project doesn't require all that, you don't need to have all of this stuff, but at least we'll cover everything. And the examples that I would use that you're probably familiar with are, like NSF centers. I was talking with Christine, we're both working right now on the convergent ERC pre-proposals that are due soon. NIH has some of the U projects, the U19s, that sort of stuff. NASA has the astrobiology and CAN projects. So these are the real big convergent type of projects. Why don't you in the chat type any of the types of projects that you're involved with. Let's just see the kind of big convergent projects that you may have. Good, I see all my competitors for the ERC. Good. Christine and Grace, the Science and Technology Centers. I started working on convergence about the time of the very first STCs and Science of Learning Centers also. Aaron, you're familiar with the NASA stuff. Good. Oh, Department of Energy, I wasn't familiar with that. That's a good one. Thanks, Mary. Mira, I'm helping somebody with one of those NSF COPE things. Very good. All right, so I've seen a lot of these. These are the big convergent projects. You guys are familiar with these sorts of things. So that's really good. I'm really glad to see that. So you'll know what I'm talking about. So the first challenge that we face when we try to put these things together is how do you turn PIs that are very skilled in managing research projects into leaders of these team science projects. And let me put a little perspective on this. I've been working, I might joke about this because it sounds so funny, but I've been working on this convergent science stuff since about the turn of the century. Sounds like a long time ago, but about 20 years when, UCLA, I worked in the Brain Research Institute at the time, and we had one of the IGRTs in the very first cohort. And that was about the time of NSF's Nano-Bio-Cogno Convergence project, that initiative led by Mike Rocco. And through that, I met Mike Gorman at UVA, who's a science and technology studies guy who later became the NSF STS program officer. So I have a long perspective on this. And one of the things that I've seen is the evolution over time of the management plans for these things. And what's happened is that the sponsors have become increasingly sophisticated about what works and what doesn't. And they may, and of course, you learn by making mistakes. I had a mentor that used to say that experience is or good judgment is the product of experience, and experience is the product of bad judgment. And so Mike Gorman told me that when he was the program officer at NSF for Science and Technology Studies, that he actually saw a number of convergent team science projects defunded after their first or second year because they weren't able to deliver the goods from the management side. And so what's happened is, as our science of team science has evolved and best practice has evolved, the funders have become increasingly sophisticated. And so from the perspective of a research development person, if you want to win, it's not enough to say you're going to do awesome science. You have to convince them that you can actually pull off the project. So the management plans become really critical. Now, obviously nobody wins with bad science and a good management plan, but nobody wins with good science and a bad management plan either. So this challenge of turning the researchers into leaders is really tough. They might have an R01 or an NSF standard grant. They're associate profs or full profs. They're experienced, but most of them approach this, especially the first time folks, they approach this as a way to fund their own projects and their own research more than being a team leader. And their skills in research management don't really translate into team management skills. So I wanted to start with a little poll so I could see, what you guys think. So when you're advising a PI who's applying for their first convergent science grant, what proportion of them don't appreciate what's involved in the management side? So, very few, like, in other words, most of them get it. What proportion don't appreciate? So, very few don't appreciate it. That means that they get it. Some don't appreciate it, and most don't appreciate it. Yeah, this is kind of my experience. About half the time I'm working with someone that just doesn't have a clue what's involved in managing these things. And it doesn't mean they're not open to it, it just means that they don't really know what to do. So it's interesting, what people are saying is that most of the PIs that we work with don't get it. All right, so that's very good. That's actually very good. Well, I mean, it's not good that it happens. It's good to see that you've confirmed what my own experience is. So the problem is kind of serious, and the solution is that you've got to teach them to change their story. You know, their story is mostly, yeah, Bethany's right, it means job security, right? Yeah, it only means job security if you win, you know? So the practical solution is you've got to teach them to change the story. The story for these big convergent science projects is not about the specific research that's going to be done, it's about the problem that's going to be solved. You know, I say it's the what am I going to do versus what are you going to get? The reviewers want to know what they're going to get. They don't care what you're going to do unless they get something out of it. And, you know, obviously what you do is important in order to get that, but that's not the central theme of the story. And so the challenge for turning a researcher into a leader is for them to discover what story they have to tell. What do the reviewers want to hear? And then we have to teach them how to tell it. So, you know, here's the problem with this management issue, is that management of convergence is costly. It takes a lot of effort. And so you just want to limit yourself to what's required. What does the sponsor require? Sometimes that will be explicit in the RFP. Or if it's not implicit in the, or even if it is explicit in the RFP, you want to also understand what's implicit in their strategic plan or their culture and so forth. You have to understand the sponsor. You know, when you're sitting down to read a book to your child or your grandchild, you know, it's important to, you know, what is it that they want to watch? What is it that they want to hear? You know, I have arguments all the time with my grandchildren because they just want to watch these, what I consider like, you know, really vapid TV shows. And, you know, I want to watch an important movie with them that's age appropriate, but, you know, if you're not satisfying what the reader wants in the case of funding, you're not going to get the money. You know, with my grandchildren, I can just impose my will. With the reviewers, I can't. So, you know, thinking about these sponsor explicit requirements, some of them will have specific products, like, you know, NASA and NIH frequently say we want a product. Some of them will want certain outcomes, like NSF for their research traineeships. They'll want certain types of people trained. Other sponsors will want certain members. Like, you know, a lot of folks are here from the NIH Cancer Institutes, you know, and the notion of translational medicine, where you have to have clinic participants or industry partners for ERCs, right? The USAID, when they do projects overseas for economic development, they may want you know, local government experts, or they may want people who have subject matter expertise, like in forestry or whatever the thing is. But then the other part of management convergence is what is required by the problem. You know, what's the scope of subject matter that's involved? What's the type of technical expertise that's necessary? And so when you think about these problem requirements, there's three aspects. One is the cognitive challenge, which is how do I create shared meaning so that people from the different disciplines and different sectors can talk about the same thing. And then besides the cognitive dimension, there's a structural dimension. It's like, how do I actually manage the exchange of knowledge between these people? You know, creating shared meaning is a kind of a mental process, but managing the process of handoffs of information and trading of information, that's a kind of a structural issue. And then the third aspect is the processual thing of, you know, enforcing ground rules and managing conflict. And if you're in a distributed team across, you know, continents, how do you handle that sort of thing? So, you know, once you start to think about this sort of stuff, then it's really important to study the problem. Before you know how to manage it, you've got to say, you know, what am I trying to manage? So I like this. This is a little thought about the contours of team science. And they're arranged in this way for a particular reason. You'll see that in a moment. But disciplinary, you could have a team that's entirely within a single discipline. That's fine. You could have a multidisciplinary team. It might require multiple expertise, but the problem is divisible. Then an interdisciplinary team is one that has multiple disciplines but requires communication. And one of the things that's very common in interdisciplinary projects is that people often try to respond to this with a multidisciplinary approach, that they don't really have a way to cross those boundaries. They just say, we're going to have this expert and that expert and the other expert. So if you have an interdisciplinary project, you've got to manage that communication issue. And then the convergence is a transdisciplinary problem. That it means they're requiring a new approach that transcends the existing expertise. An example, I saw that we had someone doing NASA. So the NASA Astrobiology Initiative is one of those. It really requires marshaling completely different paradigms and coming together there's like geology and planetary science and imaging and biology and chemistry, and they've all got to come together. Neuroeconomics is another emerging field that's kind of interesting in this sense. Also comes from it actually came out of the NSF neurocogno-bio convergence issue. So, once you know what type of project you're dealing with, you have different types of management challenges. So within a discipline, the PI just commands people what to do, right? If you have a multidisciplinary project, it's just coordination. If you have an interdisciplinary project, it's translation of languages across disciplinary boundaries. And then if you have a transdisciplinary project, it's acculturation. And that is really expensive and difficult. So, once you understand the management challenges, now you can begin to design your management plan. So I just briefly want to talk about creating meaning and exchanging knowledge. So those are really the key issues of a transdisciplinary project. And that's that compelling story. How do you discover that compelling story? So ideally, this should happen very early. The initial project team should participate because you want that diversity of perspective. You want and also you want people's commitment and participation. So ideally, you want the whole team to participate in defining what their story will be. But if this is a convergent project, you have to realize that knowledge will accumulate and that story may change. And so that creating meaning and exchanging knowledge are ongoing and may need to be reproduced. And this can be very costly. So let's go back to the chat box for a moment and think about the ways that you have done this. What kind of ideation projects have you had? What kind of ideation activities have you used to get people to create that shared meaning and exchange knowledge? Just go ahead and type that in the chat box. Good. Good, very good. So yeah, I see that people are putting in a lot of things that are that kind of span a wide range of intensities. So, people are talking about visioning sessions, a glossary, word cloud type things, all the way up to strategic doing. I see Mira's done that. I attended a workshop on strategic doing at the last NORDIP conference, and I just fell in love with it. But until I have clients that need it, I'm not going to spend the money to be trained. But then when I have clients that need it, I'm either going to spend the money to get trained myself, or I'm going to bring in a strategic doing expert to partner with. Christina's done SOAR. So, we've hit on a few things that are very interesting. Another one that I didn't see maybe we don't have enough engineers here, is prototyping. A lot of engineers will start by prototyping something, and then this, in science and technology studies, this is called creating a boundary object that everyone can look at and create the shared meaning in that object. And this is really important. And I want to talk for a moment about appreciative inquiry. I'll talk about that in a moment. But Amy is here, and go ahead and unmute, Amy. And so the reason I asked her to come is that I attended her last workshop, and I've been working on an appreciative inquiry summit with a client when the pandemic hit. And so I had to think, how am I going to do this virtually? And so I was really impressed with her presentation and asked her to partner with me to develop a virtual AI summit. I'll talk about the AI summit in a moment, but Amy, let me just ask you, what do you do besides what people have said, or how do you modify what people have said here in order to make this work virtually?
Yeah, great. Thanks. Can you hear me, Alan?
I do.
Okay, just checking. Hi, everyone. Good to see you again. Yeah, so it's interesting that Alan's asking me this question. So last month when I presented to you all, I was focusing on how to make your virtual meetings and virtual events more engaging. But particularly before the pandemic, my primary expertise is actually in innovation and creativity. That's what my PhD research was on. So a couple thoughts for generating ideas in a virtual space. I want to share with you 2 tools and 1 tip. Alan, is it okay if I share my screen?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. There you go.
All right. So I'm going to show you, let me just first say, one of the things I think is really helpful when you're trying to generate ideas with each other, especially in a group context, is stop doing it just verbally. And that's, the classic brainstorming technique is someone throws out an issue, everybody starts sharing ideas verbally. And there's a couple of problems with that. Well, actually, there's many problems. There's been a bunch of research on how it's not the most effective technique, which, those of you who threw some other things in there in the chat, there's other techniques besides that. But it tends to be our default because it's the one that is the most popular. Now, there are some situations where brainstorming is highly effective, but we're not going to get into that. So instead, I want to share with you some other techniques. So one of the things that can be really helpful is if you can generate the ideas simultaneously and in writing. So if you're in person, of course, you all probably know this already, but one of the most helpful tools is just a simple Post-it note. And everybody's writing their ideas down, 1 idea per Post-it note, throw it in the middle of the table or up on a wall. It's all happening simultaneously, so we don't have to go one at a time, which can be very slow. And it also means you're not getting influenced by each other's ideas, which is really helpful. So I wanted to show you a tool that you can do this virtually. And some of you may already be familiar with this. This is a tool called Jamboard by Google, and it's free. Sorry, those of you, if anybody's working in federal government, you're not going to have access to this because you can't access Google. But for everyone else, and there's some other similar tools out there, but I want to show you you'll see up on my screen right now, this is an example of the results of a ideation session I did with a group back in June, right after COVID hit. And these were just some of the ideas that they came up with. And the specifics aren't important, but what is important is that everybody can just simultaneously create their ideas. So here's how it works is you as the facilitator, whoever's leading this, would write up a question, and then people can just type their ideas in, and it just pops up on the board. You can change the colors of them, you can move them around, whatever. So it's a really great way to just quickly get ideas up. So that's what I would start with if I was trying to do an ideation session, is something like this. And then eventually what will happen is people will they'll just run out of ideas. Some groups that might be 3 to 5 minutes, other groups that might be 5 to 10 minutes, but you want to mix it up and throw in a second technique, maybe even 2 or 3 techniques. So another technique that I use is a technique that's called associations, probably the simplest that's like the technical definition. But I have this deck of cards that I created about 8 years ago called climber cards. So I'm holding them up to the camera. It's a physical deck, but what you're seeing on the screen is a prototype of the virtual version of these. And the way this works is that you could put these up on the screen, or if you're in person, you lay them all out, and you just ask, what ideas do you get from these images for our particular challenge, whatever you're working on? And people just say really different things because the cards are here. In the virtual version, you actually click on them, and then you write your name and you type in your response, and everybody can then see each other's responses, which we won't get into that. I'll put a link in the chat if you're interested in getting the virtual version of Climber cards. They're like a week or two away from being finished. I'm working with a software company, and I'm learning that software projects are like construction projects and they never finish on time, but that's okay. So those are two techniques. And then finally, just one little tip that I would share when you're trying to generate ideas is just be clear with each other. Like initially, you know, when you're starting the ideation, what are the boundaries and rules? So for instance, like suspending judgment is a really helpful thing to just clarify. Like, yeah, we're going to judge these ideas initially or eventually, but not yet. So suspending judgment, building on each other's ideas, we're going for quantity, start numbering the ideas. That alone can give you more ideas and give you better ideas. So those are just a couple tips to just clarify the rules for the ideation, and then Jamboard or some visuals like Climber cards can be really helpful.
Great, thank you. So, you know, I mentioned the AI Summit. If you're familiar with this, you'll know that an AI Summit is typically a 4-day event. It's designed not just to create meaning, but also to build commitment and to commitment among various partners, and to get their commitment of resources. I see that, you know, Jeff Anoli is here, who did that workshop on strategic doing. And I guess if you're thinking about something at that level, strategic doing or AI summits, you have to recognize that these things are very expensive. I mean, you probably should budget around $100,000 for you know, a full program. And so you know, it's important to recognize that if you have to go to the very high end, that you know, that needs to be considered early on. And then some of the techniques that Amy has talked about, or people have put into the chat, are useful on a more limited basis. So I want to turn now to the second challenge. The second challenge is how do you make that story compelling? So the first challenge is get them to change the story. The second is how do you tell a good story? So, you know, what people expect in a good story is two things. The first is a BHAG. This is a concept that comes from the management literature of the 1990s. Two Harvard profs came up with it. A BHAG stands for a big, hairy, audacious goal. You know, most of us are focused on SMART goals, which is nice when you're thinking about budgeting and procedure. But when you're thinking about where is the whole team going, you know, you need a BHAG. And so that's the plot. The plot is contained in the science, the team, and the outcomes. And that's the core of the story. But the other thing that a compelling story has is engagement. You know, you want the reviewer at every step to go, wow, that's interesting. What's next? Wow, what's next? And so for that, you need to start with a storyboard. And the practical solution for that is to avoid the too hard basket. Now, I don't know if we have any Aussies among us, but I put that little map of Australia up there because that's where this concept of the too hard basket comes from. I'm in LA, and, you know, Californians are thought to be the most laid back people, but, you know, God bless the Aussies. They have us trumped. And so they have a concept they call the too hard basket. You know, we have the in basket and the out basket. They have the too hard basket. The too hard basket works like this. You know, you might say, hey, Bruce, did you look at that proposal I gave you the other day? And Bruce would say, yeah. And so what'd you do with it? He said, I put it in the too hard basket. It means that Bruce looked at it, and it might be something good, might not be something good, too hard to tell. So he put it in the too hard basket. Well, the Aussies' too hard basket is the equivalent of our round file. It's the trash. Nothing happens. So the solution to telling that compelling story, to engaging them, is you've got to avoid that too hard basket. And the way you do that is you start out with best practice. You know, 20 years ago, there was no best practice. Now we already know what best practice is. You start with that, but then you have to do some, you know, brain steering and editing and discussion to fit that to the contours of the current project. You know, we talked about the, you know, all of those contours of a convergent project. But then the secret is the details. The details are what make the difference, and the details are what keep you out of the too hard basket. So let's talk, as I say in Yiddish, let's talk Talkless, focus. So the storyboard for your management plan should have about 6 parts. And of course, these will be more or less important depending on the scope of your management challenge. You've got the budget, you've got governance, you've got training, you've got incentives, you've got infrastructure, and you have evaluation. Those are the 6 dimensions. So I'm going to, let's see, I want to do another poll here. Of these 6 elements, which do you think is the most difficult to design? Okay, 25% of you haven't weighed in. I want everyone to weigh in. I guess some people are reading their email or they're on their phones. Okay, let's start with this. All right, I'm going to stop the share and we'll discuss these in the order that you found the most important. But let me say that there's more detail when you get the slide set in the notes. There'll be a little bit more detail. So we don't need to worry about that now. I'll just talk like this. But the most important one people thought was team development, and the second is evaluation. So let me just zoom down to team development a little bit. So I called it team development here, but in the poll I gave Christine this poll to make, and I called it team development because that's what I had in another slide. But here for our point, I called it training. And what I want to think about in terms of training is that you need to have a full scope of training. So in the first instance is compliance and skill-based stuff. So compliance is you've got to, especially for your graduate students and postdocs, you've got to specifically say, how are they going to learn special lab techniques or materials handling or that sort of stuff. But the other part of skills is scientific techniques, especially where you need people to understand what their colleagues in other disciplines are doing. And so, you may be in a situation where people actually have to rotate into labs of other disciplines so that they learn, how do the engineers handle this? Let me talk a little bit about what I consider the best management plan I ever wrote, which was for an NIH U19 tissue engineering project. NIH wanted people to create artificial organs that could be used as research platforms. So, back in the team development side, in the explicit requirements of the sponsor, they said, you must have let me actually find the exact language, it's kind of interesting. Each center must establish and manage a multidisciplinary program focused on the development of a specific human tissue model. Each center will comprise a team of researchers with demonstrated expertise in infectious diseases and tissue engineering, as well as applicable expertise depending on the proposed model in immunology, microbiology, biomedical imaging, or assay development. So, one of the things that was really important to us is how are people going to learn what's possible from the other disciplines. And so what we came up with was that the postdocs and graduate students would rotate through, would do rotations in labs in other disciplines. And another thing that we created structurally for the governance side was we created a team of what we called negotiators. Even though they were assigned to a particular research project, they would attend lab meetings of other projects in other disciplines. And these were people who were junior faculty who had been trained in one discipline and done a postdoc in a different one, so that they already had kind of a breadth of knowledge, what people sometimes are now calling comb-shaped knowledge. It used to be called T-shaped knowledge. In other words, they have a broad range of deep areas of information. So that team development side became very important. And one of the things that I suggest you do for your team development is make reference to a specific training program, right? The PI, or maybe the research director, or maybe a couple of key people from the team should attend some of these training programs, like Colorado State's Team Science Workshop. I have no affiliation or financial interest in that, by the way. Michigan State's Toolbox project from NSF is a long-standing project. They'll come in and do training for your team locally, or you can have virtual training. So, one of the things that's important to have in your team development side is explicit activities, either to develop team knowledge or to develop team competency. Another thing that I like to see in a good management plan is laddering. So, we want the pre and the postdocs to all develop their skills, and the mid-career faculty to learn how to design multi-investigator projects. And, and we want the PI to, learn how, university and agencies operate and science policy operates. We want them to become a VP of research or eventually join the, National Science Council sort of thing. So, all of this stuff needs to be budgeted. And that's really critical. And, I mentioned that one management plan that I thought was the best one that I ever wrote. There were 3 reviewers. 2 of the reviewers raved about it. They talked about all the great stuff. And I'll be honest, it wasn't just me. This proposal format treated the administrative core as a separate core and gave them 12 pages, just like any other core. So, you rarely have the luxury of a 12-page management plan. So that's why all that detail was in there. 2 of the reviewers raved about it and listed strengths and said no weaknesses. The 3rd reviewer raved about it even more, but the weaknesses were there's not enough money to do all this. It all needs to be done, but there's not enough money. So, that is really critical. People also talked about evaluation. Let me just make a couple of comments about evaluation. So, one of the things that you need to think about is that the evaluation is going to be much more complex for a convergent project. And let me find my notes here. So, one of the things is that you have to recognize that there's traditional evaluation, and then there's also a technology assessment, which is a very European style. And then, you have other models like, 4th generation model, which incorporates stakeholder issues and so forth. One of the things that's really important to think about with evaluation is that, again, you need detail. How is it going to be done? And then evaluation isn't just the formal evaluation, it's also the internal evaluation. So, I want to link that here to governance, which not a lot of people mention, but I think is hyper important. And that is one of the things that you want to do with evaluation, with governance, is you want to talk about all of the organs and what are they actually going to do. So, how are you going to resolve conflicts? How is that going to happen? How are you going to, let me think, how are you going to make decisions and evaluate decisions? Fiscal oversight. Advisory committees is part of evaluation, right? So, evaluation spans a lot of areas, and you have to think about what's really critical for yours. I just want to talk for maybe 1 or 2 more minutes, just so that we can leave time for open questions. And again, as I said, infrastructure, if you look at, when you see the slide deck, you'll see there's some notes and slides on that and so forth. But I just want to talk very briefly about governance, just to give you an idea of what's happening. And that is that, let me just, no, that's fine. That's fine. Let me just, I want to just do a quick share screen. Let me just talk about governance for a moment. Here you've got to think about the structures and systems. So, when you look at this, here's some technical and management issues. This this is kind of old. This is 15 years ago when people were talking, when there was this kind of collaboratories movement. But you can see that what we have in the collaboratories is very similar anyway to the kind of stuff that we have to do. Oops, hold on. And so, you know, from this you can see, based on what you're trying to do, you might have very different technology problems that need to be managed, and then the management. These are the governance problems, like how do you elicit contributions if you have a virtual community of practice, right? If you have a distributed research center, how do you handle the shared administrative support and the IP policies and so forth? The RCs are interesting. They actually require an organ called the Dean's Council, and it's unclear what's going on there, but really the reality is the Dean's Council is responsible for negotiating differences between my institution and your institution about IP policy and merit and promotion and all that sort of stuff. So governance shouldn't be overlooked, because those of you that have lost these competitions will often find reviewer comments about that. It's unclear how they're going to handle this, or it's unclear how they're going to handle that. You want to be as explicit as possible. And so, for example, in your org chart, I mentioned those negotiators. In your org chart, you want to have all these organs in here. You can see the organs are listed by whether they're advisory or cores or research or boundary spanning. But then in your management plan, you want to discuss how they're actually going to function. How often are they going to meet? What are they going to decide? What's their scope of control and oversight? You know, we talked about, people put evaluation in there because, you know, it's challenging on the usual sense, but it's even more challenging now when you think about the scope of evaluation. Doesn't just have to be, you know, did I train enough people? You know, did the clinics participate and so forth? It also has to be, the evaluation also has to be, you know, the functioning of the system, the functioning of the center. So I want, just in the interest of time, I want to stop and just open it up to general questions. Let's do that for about 10 minutes, and we can go for it. Oh, Christine, Christine put in there, did you not see the poll results? I forgot to share them. I'm sorry. I forgot that I needed to share.
No problem. Thank you for that so far.
There you
I'm really
go.
excited for this.
There
They are.
So, you know, Kavita asked about planning to include an evaluator from the get-go. Yes. In fact, you know, I always tell people that the evaluator should participate in writing the proposal. Once you know what you're going to do, and you already know how this, what the sponsor is going to require, then bring in the evaluator and have them write the evaluation plan. And it can be provisional, but, you know, and the good news is most of the evaluators will do this without charge, with the proviso that if the project is funded, that they get the evaluation contract. And again, in terms of budgeting, you know, it's not unusual to spend 10 to 15% of the budget on evaluation. And so, you know, you should think about that. You know, I say that as an average, but there's an old saw about averages. You know, if you have 1 foot in ice water and 1 foot in boiling water, on average, you're comfortable. So, you know, 10 to 15% is kind of a rough estimate, but it depends on your project. Any other questions? If you have no questions, I can talk about one of the things that I didn't cover. One of the management dimensions that I didn't cover, but go ahead. This is your time.
I think Bethany had a comment in the chat about the virtual sticky notes and sort of trade-offs with the different types of platforms.
Yeah.
You want me to talk about that, Alan?
Yeah, Amy, just very briefly.
Yeah, I mean, Bethany, I would say yes, it is a trade-off. It's also a problem with handwritten sticky notes. The tool Mural, which somebody, I think Christine mentioned earlier, does allow exporting of the content into a spreadsheet, which is kind of cool. But Mural is not for the faint of heart. It is, I would not use it with a group that was just going to, you know, use it one time. But if you're with a team that might use it over and over, it's excellent. So yeah, and definitely I've done brainwriting into a Google Doc, which can be nice for all those reasons. Yeah, does that help, Bethany?
Thanks. Georgia asked a tough question. What do you do if a team member doesn't comply? This is really very interesting. You know, there's actually a fair amount of research on this from the science of team science, and the reality is that, you know what, sometimes you have to remove somebody from a team. The problem is that if the PI or the leadership council does that unilaterally, it kind of foments unhappiness. And so what needs to happen is that a broad participation of the team needs to concur that the person needs to be removed or managed in some way, and then you know, once that happens, then it can be done. And you know, and then it's just a matter of replacing the person with someone with similar or different credentials. And by the way, sometimes it's not just a matter of compliance. Sometimes, you know, if you have an ERC, you know, you can expect, say, 10 years of funding. Well, you know, 6 years into it, you may have discovered completely different problems, and you may need a completely different team. And so, you know, replacing the team members isn't just, you know, getting rid of the recalcitrant, you know, bad folks. Sometimes it's replacing them with people that have the skills that are now necessary. Great. Pips and Holly are on this notion of the collaboration and culture and team development. You know, this is so important. And again, as I say, you've got a budget for this. And you know, I'll tell you, interesting, as a consultant, I usually come in at the very end. You know, I'm brought in by the research office because they don't have the capacity, or they think that the project is going to fail, and you know, why spend more money on it, or their time, that sort of thing. And so very often I come in when the project is already pretty much underway and the team is in place. And so this kind of touches on budget and team development. I mentioned that one reviewer didn't like the fact that we didn't have enough money in the budget for those kind of infrastructure and team development activities. Well, the reason we didn't have the money in the budget is that the way most of the PIs work is it's like a play date. They call their friends. It's like, hey, I need somebody that can do this. Oh, I know someone there that does it, or I know someone here that does it. And they bring those people in, and those folks say, hey, you know, yeah, I'd love to participate. I need, you know, this, and this, and they give the PI a budget. And then, you know, the budget is all spent on those activities rather than the team development activities that are actually necessary to win the thing. So instead of getting, you know, 80% of what they want, they got 100% of nothing. And so, you know, that notion of team formation and budgeting, that budgeting has to be very much of a top-down process. You've got to decide, you know, what do I need for team development? What do I need for evaluation? What do I need for governance, right? Because those are the sufficient conditions to win. And then do I still have enough left over in my research budget to do the proper amount of research? Well, you know, maybe what I do is I reduce the amount of research I'm going to start with. I only start with 1 or 2 projects instead of 4 projects, right? Or maybe I, you know, cut back on the, you know, team development and governance stuff as much as possible. Or, you know, maybe I don't go for a convergent science project. Maybe I just write an individual investigator grant to do my own research. And so these are the kind of conversations that have to happen very, very early on.
Alan, do you have references for that sort of team development, like budgeting it in and all that? Well,
you know, I think that, you know, if you go to the, I will get some references for you. I know where they are, but you know, a lot of what I've talked about is really just from my own experience, but I have read the references. I just didn't cite them here. A lot of it comes from some of the NIH report and some of the NAS, National Academies reports. And then there's lots of individual citations in the literature about this. But actually about budgeting, I don't see a lot. I actually don't see a lot of literature on budgeting per se, you know. All right, we'll take just 1 or 2 more questions. One more question, and if no question, I'll talk about one more thing.
Can I actually ask this verbally rather than typing it in the chat, because it's a little bit complicated?
Absolutely. Go ahead, Holly.
Well, it's about how do you manage conflict, or how do you plan to manage conflict, right? Because to me, it seems like in part it's, well, it depends on what the particular conflict is. And so when writing this into a proposal, proposals management plan, I mean, do you sort of anticipate potential conflicts? Or, it seems like it's hard to sort of write about specifics when you don't actually know what the conflict is yet.
Well, actually, there are certain kinds of conflicts that are known. I want to read something. So one type of conflict that's one type of well-known conflict is publication. Who gets publication credit? And so, one of the things that you can say there is that, we will follow I made a note of this. Let me grab it. Hold on. I made a note of this and then I put it in the wrong file. It's from the management plan that I talked about for the U19. And so one of the things is that you actually talk about the organs. So for example, that the advisory committee, one of the things that the advisory committee will do is to resolve conflicts about publications. And they say, there are protocols for this that are published, like I think there's a medical journal association that publishes protocols for how this is handled. So that's one type of conflict that's very common. Another, if you want to think about the interpersonal conflicts, I think that's more difficult, obviously. One of the things that you can say is that that could be a purview of the executive committee's discussion, and that they will make a ruling about how things should happen, and or they will advise the PI, and then that should come from the PI about how the conflict is done. And that's a case where the PI can just make a command. You have to play nice, or we're going to separate you. You have to come up with a strategy that's appropriate to the situation. One of the things that we said also is, what if there's a conflict between the PI and the co-PI or something like that? Well, how's that going to be handled? We said that the advisory committee will intervene and so forth. So there's a variety of things that are likely to happen that we know how to handle, and you should make that explicit,
Right.
because it just gives confidence to the reviewers that you've thought about it.
Thanks.
All right, so I wanted to leave 5 minutes for Christine to wrap up. Do you need the full 5 minutes, Christine?
Nope, go for it.
Okay, so let's see. I'll talk about one other thing. Infrastructure, because this is easy to deal with. Am I still screen sharing, by the way?
I don't think so.
No, you're not.
Okay, that's fine. So for infrastructure, you need to think about 4 things. What about the project management infrastructure? Are you going to use Trello or Basecamp or one of these sorts of things? Do you have a proprietary thing? The data management, the cores, the telescience. So for these kind of things that you really need to think about, how are we going to manage it? I was lucky to work with, at ASU, I was really lucky that they have a dedicated project management academy with software and stuff like that. So we just said to do that. But if you go to Wikipedia and look for a list of collaborative software, let me bring that up actually. This is an old one, by the way. They might have updated it. But here's a list of the various types of collaborative software that are available, and how it works and that sort of stuff. So that can be helpful. Some of the other stuff that is important in infrastructure is, let me get one more. No, that's it. That's what I had for infrastructure. So, think about these things. Just saying in there that, oh, we're going to have weekly meetings by Zoom, that's fine. But if you can say that we're going to use a shared project management system, going back to the stuff that we were talking about for the collaboratories, what if you have shared equipment? Nanotechnology people, for example, they very often are in a situation where they need a very expensive equipment that's going to be controlled remotely. Well, how's that going to be controlled? So that's it. I'll leave that left a couple of minutes for Christine to wrap up. So, and I'm going to now type my contact information into the chat room.
There's a fire near Tom, Australia, and his power is out.
Holy shit.
Okay, is everyone okay? As I heard that there's a fire somewhere, but
Whoa.
Did I hear that right?
That's not good.
Hopefully everyone is okay.
Where's the fire?
I don't know, please, if you're having a fire, please get off the Zoom.
We may need to evacuate.
Yeah.
Could happen. I've been looking at the map. It doesn't
I'm
look.
going to mute
Okay.
Catherine.
Close.
Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, that's an exciting end to a really great webinar. Thank you so much, Alan. And I see that Arian Cease had one more question, so maybe I'll let you two connect about having an executive committee that does not include the lead PI. So maybe
No, I'd say no.
No?
That's all it takes. The PI needs to be on the executive committee.
All right. Question answered. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And we look forward to having you guys on next month's webinar, which is going to be about 3D team leadership with Bradley Kirkman from North Carolina State. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you next month. And have a great rest of your Tuesday. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.